One of the other more common barriers associated with shared use is the thought that if more people are coming into our facilities and using them, then it's going to cost more. We're going to have the lights on more regularly. We're going to have more custodial staff to come and clean up the facility after people use it. Things are going to get broken. And while that's a very real perception, we thought it was important to do some research on this to see what in fact are the costs associated with having outside groups use the facilities on a regular basis. In an effort to try to understand what some of these additional costs would be and how large they might be, several years ago my colleagues and I engaged in a research project funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to see what the actual costs would be to an organization to sharing their facilities with outside groups. So what we did is we solicited the support of a school district in North Carolina, and we actually were able to observe a couple things. One, how much shared use was going on in 30 middle schools across this district. And then we were also able to measure the costs of managing those facilities. So we felt quite confident that with such a large data set, we would be able to determine how much increase in costs would be associated with an increase in use by groups that are outside of the school system. So what did we find? Well, we found certainly that there was more use and it was varied across the 30 middle schools. So some schools had a lot of shared use, and as you might expect, a number of schools did not have any shared use or very little. So the first thing we did is we categorized all the schools into 3 levels of shared use. Level 1 being the lowest, having very little, and then level 2 a moderate amount, and then level 3 very high. And then we compared that with the cost of operating the facilities that were being shared with those outside groups. So let's take a look at what the results looked like. Well, as you can see in this first graph, as expected, with more shared use, you had more participants in after-school programs in those facilities, okay? No big shocker there. So the other thing we wanted to look at was the minutes of physical activity that were occurring in those facilities that had shared use. It's one thing to say we have more people coming into the facility, but we were particularly interested in how much physical activity they were doing. So we documented the amount of physical activity that was going on in those schools as well. And again, no big surprise, the more shared use, the more physical activity that was occurring. Well, here's where it got really interesting in the study. When we looked at the cost of operating those facilities across these 3 levels, as you can see in this graph, there really was very little, and in fact, statistically, there was no difference in the cost of operating those facilities on a per square foot basis across the 3 levels of shared use. Well, this really surprised us. So we wanted to look at it a little more deeply, and we ran the costs again. And again, you can see in this graph, this was a cost per student. And here are the results. Again, no difference, no statistical difference between the 3 groups. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we were able to confirm that shared use does in fact increase the amount of people using the facility and the amount of physical activity that's generated by that facility. But it also shows that the costs were relatively stable across all levels. Well, we had lots of conversations about how this came to be, and we went back to the agencies to try to understand this concept. And the conclusion that we came to is that school facilities in particular, and maybe more so in the south of the United States than in other parts of the country, they operate from the perspective that there are people using the facilities all the time. So the air conditioning is running, even when students aren't there. Custodial staff are generally year-long employees, even if there's no students at the facility. So these become fixed costs that are at a higher level on the assumption that there's people in the facility. So it didn't matter whether or not we had more participants in the facility. The primary costs associated with running those facilities were relatively stable. Well, does that mean there's no additional costs? Of course not. Things are still going to get broken. There's still going to be more toilet paper that gets used. There's going to be more water that gets used. So there are going to be additional costs associated with operating that facility if you have more people using it. So that's where, and you're going to learn about this later in the training, there are mechanisms to help you protect against that. There's shared use agreements, a joint use agreement that will help you articulate that if you're going to share your facility with an outside agency, you need to charge them at least a nominal fee to recover your costs. Well, what happens if something gets broken or somebody gets hurt? Well, that also needs to be stipulated in that joint use agreement, and you need to make sure that that outside agency has insurance to cover themselves if someone gets hurt. And you need to make sure it's stipulated that if something is broken while they're using the facility, that they are subsequently responsible for paying to have it repaired.